In this video we're going to take a look at some of the basics of the Burp Suite Community Edition, and we'll use the Damn Vulnerable web application to demonstrate some of the features. So I did a full series on this previously. If you're interested in seeing all these categories in detail, you can go and check that out. In this example we'll just be checking out a couple of these in order to demonstrate the core Burp Suite features. I won't be going through the full setup of Burp Suite either, so let me just mention a couple of things. One is I recommend installing Proxy or a similar extension so that you can easily swap between different configurations. Essentially, whenever you go to install Burp Suite, if you don't have it installed already, you'll need to, first of all, you'll need to install the Burp Suite certificate, so you can do that on the Privacy and Security tab. You'll be able to do that down here, and that'll allow you to use the proxy, but you'll also need to configure the network settings as well. So on the General tab down at the bottom also, you can see that here that we have, what you probably have this set to is auto detect or no proxy, and you'll need to enable manual proxy and have it set to 127.0.0.1 and 8080 if you do this manually. So that'll mean that whenever you're using Burp Suite, you'll need to come in here and have this ticked, and whenever you're not using it, you'll need to go back and untick that. If you're using Proxy, essentially you won't need to do that. So let's go and take a look at the settings here. If you go into the options of Proxy, you can see that you can set up some different proxies. You can change the settings here to say what port and what IP you want them to go through. So in this case, Burp Suite by default will go through port 8080 and on the local host. And this just means that you don't need to either go and swap between them or have Burp Suite running all the time, because you'll see here if I enable the Burp Suite proxy and try to reload the page, we get proxy server is refusing connections because we don't have Burp Suite running. So we could just have this running all the time and then always have Burp Suite in the background, but if you don't do that, then Proxy I think is the best option. So I'm going to create a new project here in Burp Suite and we'll go and test out some of the features. So when we open up Burp Suite, we are greeted on the dashboard here. Actually, this is a tab I spend very little time on. You can see some of the features require the Pro version as well. I've increased the font size here, so if that's something you want to do yourself, you can go into User Options and into Display and just increase the font size here and change the theme as well if you want to. Some of the tabs here as well you won't have at the moment. I'll cover some of the extensions that you can install at the end, some of the popular ones. And let's now that we've got Burp Suite running, let's try and reload this page again, because last time we got the proxy servers refusing connections. So we hit try again, and you'll see that it's not actually loading the page. We're stuck on the loading, and we can see that Burp Suite down here is highlighted. So let's go and take a look at it, and we have the proxy tab highlighted orange. So this is a perfect time to take a look at the Intercept tab, which is the main functionality of Burp Suite. When I say the main functionality, I mean Burp Suite's proxy, right? So it'll sit between us and whatever website we're communicating with and allow us to forward requests, drop requests, or take some kind of action on them. So in this case, we've intercepted this request. We've tried to load the page and we've intercepted this request. So if we wanted to send off something different, we might want to say, actually, we want to try and send a post request instead of a get request. So we can modify this request, which is going to be sent off, and then we can hit forward, and that'll forward our request. In this case, you can see that it hasn't loaded the page because we didn't send it a get request. We've got an error. So let's go back and we go back to our intercept. Let's just forward it and do our normal, and you can see that it's brought back the web page as it should. And we can also see that it's intercepting some additional resources which are being loaded. So we can click forward. Obviously, we don't want to do this all the time. So even without us actually browsing to different URLs, we're going to get requests coming through here. So if you don't want to have to deal with that, just click Intercept is off, which I normally do as soon as I load up Burp Suite anyway, because we have the HTTP history tab here, which means we can actually go and look through the requests which have already been sent. So rather than intercepting every request and having to take some kind of action on it, we might as well turn it off, and then we can just go and browse through our history. And whenever we do this, we have our requests on the left and our response on the right. So we can go and have a look at these in more detail. We can also filter the kind of content that we want to see here. So if you click filter at the top, we can say that we only want to see certain content types. So we might only want to look at images. You can see at the moment we're actually blocking images because generally they're not going to be too important to whatever kind of pen testing or bug hunting or whatever we're doing. We can filter by response codes, and we can also filter by scope. So this is another important thing. In our case, we're going to be looking at the damn vulnerable web application. So we don't necessarily want to be seeing responses from every other website that we load up. Say we go and do a Google search and we're going to be looking for how to do command injection, things like that. We don't necessarily want to be intercepting all of those requests. So in that case, we want to go and set up the scope. So let's go over to the target tab. You can see here we're on the sitemap tab by default, which has a map of the sites that we have visited and the different directories and files that were loaded there. We can actually just right click on a site here and say we want to add it to scope. So let's go back and let me refresh this page for a DVWA, and you can see that it's now added that to the sitemap. So that's one thing that we could do here. We could select and add this to scope. I'll do that now. Another thing that we could do is we could go into our scope here and we could just manually add in some URLs, or we could say we want to exclude certain URLs from a scope, etc. So if we go back to our proxy tab now, you'll see that's not actually changed anything for us. We still need to change this filter and say we only want to show in scope items, and if we do that, now we're only going to see things that are in scope. However, one thing to note is if we turn our intercept back on and go back to Burp Suite, go back to this Portswigger site which isn't in scope, if we reload the page, it's still going to intercept that request, which you're not necessarily going to want. So let's go and change that. We can go into our options in the Intercept tab, and we have the Intercept client requests. So these are the rules based on which it'll intercept client requests and server responses. By default, it's actually not intercepting server responses at all, because it's not really going to have much of a benefit. It's just going to change the client side content. You know, it's not going to help with pen testing or bug hunting. But there are some cases where you might want to do that anyway and have a look at exactly what's coming back from the server. So you have that option, but by default we're only intercepting client requests, and these are the rules. So it's not going to intercept requests that are images by default, for example. And here's the URL option. So if the URL is in target scope, we want to intercept it. If not, then we untick it. So let's tick that, and that'll mean that, let's go back actually and test it out. So we tick that, we'll go back to intercept. We might want to drop the request as well. That's something we can do there. We'll drop it and you'll see that it was dropped, never went to the server. But now if we reload the page, we didn't get the intercept, even though intercept is on. And if we go back to our DVWA and try to reload the page here, we will see this is intercepted as we would expect it to be. I just realized that the font size, I increased the font size of the menu options but not of the actual requests. So let's go into user options as well and change the font. I'll increase this also to 16. Apologies for that, but I don't think we've really seen anything too notable so far in the requests. So I'm just going to turn intercept off, which means this request will be forwarded as usual. And let's go and take a look at some of the features. So one of the most commonly used features is the repeater, which allows you to repeat requests. So to use this, typically I would either intercept a request, as we just had been doing there, and then we can click action and send to repeater, or you can do the exact same thing in the HTTP history tab. So we can go in here, we can right click on something, and then we can send it to the repeater, or as you can see here, Control and R, or send it to some of the other tabs as well. So let's actually, I'll turn intercept back on and we'll try to do a login here, admin, password. You'll see our request will be intercepted, so we could go ahead and modify some of these values in here, or we can send this to the repeater, and this will allow us to keep sending off new requests. So I can say here admin1 send, we can have a look and see what the response is, and very quickly I can just try something else, admin2 send, admin3 send, etc. So in cases where you're like testing SQL injection or cross-site scripting or command injection or something like that, it's this will be a lot easier in many cases than doing it inside the browser. If you need to view the response as well, you can just right click on this and we can let's show in browser. We can request in browser, we can show response in browser. Show response tick in future, just copy this URL, and this time we'll copy it, but in future it'll just automatically control and see it for us. And then we can just go and paste that into the Firefox and it'll load up the response. Now in this example, obviously this is a login situation where we might want to try a lot of different usernames and passwords. So rather than sitting and manually doing this using the repeater, what we can do is use the intruder. So let's go and, well, we can grab it from here as well, actions, send to intruder, or we can do it from the proxy tab as well. So we'll send this to the intruder, and we have our attack target here. Let's go to positions. So here's where we decide the attack type. So first of all, just before we discuss the attack types, let's have a look at what's highlighted here. So it's tried to highlight by default some of the things that we might want to try and brute force. But I'm just going to clear these, because the only things we're going to want to add these to are the username and the password. These are the only things we're going to want to loop through. In some cases you're going to need to loop through other parameters as well, and there might be other things that you want to brute force. You might be trying to brute force something like the user agent to see what user agents are allowed, you know. By default you can see it's set here to the sniper attack. So let's test out a couple of these attacks, see what the difference is. I've created some users. We've got 3 users here and we've got 3 passwords as well. Let's go back to Burp. So these 2 attacks, Sniper and Battering Ram, only use a single payload list, so either the users or the passwords list, whereas the Pitchfork and the Cluster Bomb will allow us to use multiple. So let's start with Sniper. If we go over to our Payloads tab, you can see here that we have some different options for the payload. There's only one payload which is allowed. Even though we have 2 positions, it's going to be using the same list for both positions, but we'll see that how it treats them differently compared to the Battering Ram. So in this case then, we want a simple list here, so we could select a lot of different things here. We might want to loop through numbers like 1 to 100 and step one at a time. So for example, if the URL was like users, so say we had www.test.com/user and then 0, we know that that's our user number. We might want to go through and loop through all the different user numbers or file numbers or something like that and see which ones come back with responses and which don't. Let's go back here. So in our case we're going to be using a list of passwords. Let's select the password list for this one. So you can see here we have plenty of actual password lists, but we're just going to go to the desktop and grab this password list here. And we have some other options for payload processing as well. So there are things that we can do before or after processing the payload. You can see here this is task before the payload is used, so we might want to hash it. We might need to submit passwords as an MD5, but we don't have a list of MD5s. We've got a list of passwords, so we could MD5 it on the way. We could base64 encode it or something like that. So there's a lot of different options that you can use here. For us, we don't really need to do too much here. Let's just go ahead and, well, we'll start the attack. Let me just say as well, in the options tab here, some of the things that we can do as well. So we can also grep for responses. We can extract things from the responses. We can grep things in the payload. In fact, we might do that shortly. Let's start the attack here. See here that the free version is throttled. And we can go through then and we can look at all of our requests. You can see that our requests have been sent off here. We can have a look at our responses as well. And we might judge that based on the length of the response that's coming back, whether or not the password was correct or incorrect. Let's have a look at the actual responses here and see what it did say. You can see here we got username or password is incorrect. So let me just quickly go back and demonstrate what we were talking about there with the match. So if we wanted to say we want to find out if the username or password is incorrect, let's add that as a simple string. In fact, I should have cleared these first. We'll clear these out. We'll add that, and then let me try and okay, so that actually added it, retroactively searched the responses to find these in there. So we should have actually put in the correct username and the correct password so that we could see which one was going to be correct. But let me quickly go back and I think administrator. I'm going to change this to administrator. Or it might be admin. Okay, well, we'll see. But in this case, obviously, it only looped through the passwords anyway. And how did it do that? Well, if we go and have a look at our requests, we can see here it did password, password, and then it did secure password, then it did test password, and then we had admin3 password, admin3 password. So admin3 was what we had in our initial, let me go back here. This is what we had initially, admin3 and password. So essentially it's looped through the username 3 times and it's attempted to use our 3 passwords, and then it's looped through the password 3 times and attempted to use our passwords rather than doing them both at the same time. Whereas if we change this to the battering ram, let's change it and let's actually not change anything at all. We'll start another attack here. We'll loop through and this time we'll see we have password, password, secure, secure, and test, test. So you can see the difference there. It's used the same value each time in the battering ram, whereas in the sniper it went through each value and we had 6 requests instead of 3. Hopefully that explains that okay. In our example, obviously this isn't ideal because we're trying to test for usernames and passwords, but if we were only testing for passwords, then something like that would work fine for us. Let's move on then and actually see if we can enumerate usernames and passwords. So the pitchfork and the cluster bomb will both take multiple payload lists. So we'll be able to loop through the usernames and the passwords. So if we go now, we'll see that we have 2 sets of payloads. If we would have highlighted more things here, if we add some more of these, we'll see that we have 3 sets of payloads that we can use. Let me go back and undo that. So in this case, our first list is going to be our usernames. So let's grab the usernames, admin, John, and Kate. And then the second payload list will be our passwords. So we've loaded 3 usernames, 3 passwords. Let's hit start attack and see what happens. And you can see it's run each username against each password in the list. So admin was run against password, John was run against secure, and Kate was run against test. Which in our case, we want to try each one of these passwords against each one of the usernames ideally, so that's not going to be the best in our scenario. Note that the administrator and password wasn't correct, so I'm going to go back and actually I'm going to clear that and I'm going to set that to admin just so that we can actually see a correct login as well. That was meant to be the users. Let me load that again, users. And then our second payload set is our passwords, and let's change that to the cluster bomb. We don't need to change anything else. We'll hit start. You can see it's looped through there. So you can see that the length here is different. So we might want to filter by length if we're running a brute force to see which one comes back with something different. We might want to filter by the response code, or as I'd said previously, we might want to go and set up our options as well so that we can actually grep for the match here. So it's something like success. If we add that and go to our results, okay, no. Which one was a successful one? Let's have a look at the response. Welcome. Okay, so welcome to password protected admin area. So we know what the successful result is then. Let's add that. Go to our results and you can see that's the only one that had that response in it. I think that covers the key attack types here that we have in the Intruder tab. I must say that without the Pro version, it can be very slow brute forcing using Burp Suite, so sometimes the other options are better for this. I would say that covers the main features of Burp Suite that I would use on a regular basis, being the interceptor, the repeater, and then the intruder, probably in that order. But we do have some other ones here, so let's take a look at them. Sequencer. This is a tool for analyzing the quality of randomness. So let's go and take a look at, we have a weak sessions ID category here. Let's click generate here and we're going to see what it does. We'll go back to our Proxy tab. Let me actually just note as well, we'll turn Intercept on here And we have some other options in Intercept which I didn't mention earlier. So for example, response modification, we do have some cool options here to unhide hidden form fields, prominently highlight them, enable disabled form fields, remove field length limits, remove JavaScript form validation. These are some really handy things to have on, so I think it's worth enabling most of those. And I didn't really mention much about the match and replace. We saw that whenever we use the intruder, we were able to grep and match, and we were also able to grep and extract, although we didn't test out that function in that case. But here we can also use match and replace. So if we wanted to specify a user agent, for example, say we're using Mozilla and only a very specific version of Internet Explorer is allowed on the website, we might want to just replace our user agent for every request that we make to websites. And then we can do the same with responses as well. I'm not going to enable any of that here, but let's just actually go back. Since enabling some of these response modifications, I'm going to reload the page and just see, do we have anything new here? We've got our Intercept currently turned on. Let's go back to the Intercept. So we have our Intercept on, and you can see in this case we have this DVWA session is equal to 1. Let's forward that. And I'm going to turn Intercept off again for a second. So we don't really see any differences there in terms of the responses being replaced. I'm just trying to see. Here we have an example with the JavaScript, so you can see it's highlighted it in red. Let's go back and disable some of these options again and refresh this page, so you can see that that's changed. And things like the limits particularly handy. Whenever I was doing some of these DVWA challenges, some of the XSS, or I think, yeah, the XSS challenges had quite small limits in them in terms of the amount of characters that you could enter. But okay, we're going off topic a little bit. Let's go back to our session IDs, hit generate here again, go to our HTTP history, and we can have a look and see. So you can see that the DVWA session is now set to 2. So what we can do here is we can right click this and send it to our sequencer. So we go over to the sequencer and we'll see our requests in here, and we can go to start live capture. So you can see here it's using a cookie, DVWA session is equal to 3, so that's what it's actually testing at the moment. Let's click start capture. It can take a little while to run through this. We can hit auto analyze here as well, so it'll analyze as it's going through. And essentially what it's going to tell us here is, let me turn that off. The overall result of randomness within the sample is estimated to be extremely poor. At significance level of 1%, the amount of effective entropy is estimated to be 0 bits. So it's basically completely predictable. We know that every time the page is reloaded, every time the new session is created, we get a sequential value. So it's going to go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. So yeah, it's not really a tool that I use particularly often in Burp Suite, but if you're doing bug bounties and stuff like that, I guess it'll provide some useful automation. Let's also have a look at this Decoder tab. So I'm not too sure if we have what challenges in here this might be helpful for. Let's try and submit this. We're going to have a look at the HTTP history, which you can clear this at any point as well, by the way. Just clear history here, or you can manually specify some items that you want to delete. But in this case, let's just go and take a look. We have our phrase change me. Okay, I was kind of hoping there would be some base64 encoding or something there, but I'm not too sure where there will be some. So let me just change me token. Maybe I'm going to change the difficulty actually just slightly. I think maybe if we have the difficulty a little bit higher, that might work for us. Let me submit that. No, okay, I thought there might have been a token there. Well, if there was something of interest here, say this was base64 encoded, we could send this to the decoder, and then you can see the tab highlighted here. We'll go here and it'll ask us what do we want to decode it as or encode as. So let's encode it. We'll encode it as base64. This will get us a base64 encoded value, and let's just assume that that was what was there, and we were actually decoding as base64, and that would get us our result. So we have some different types of encoding that we can do here and decoding, and it'll just save you going to some of the websites which you might normally use to do that on, although I still have a bad habit of doing that myself as well. We'll look into some plugins which can actually do a better job at some of this for us towards the end as well. The only other thing I'll mention about decoding and encoding is URL encoding. So sometimes we might be sending off a request and we have some say the, I don't know, username is equal to admin, and we're inserting in here some SQL injection, and you can see we're inserting some spaces, we might be inserting some equals and things like that. So what you might want to do here is you can either select it and right click, and we should have a URL encode as you type. Okay, there should be some kind of encoding thing in here. There's Hackverter, so this is one of the extensions that we'll look into, so you can see that once this is installed you can quite easily go and convert these. We could go ahead and hash that. But sorry, what I did actually just want to demonstrate wasn't that. So it was just the URL encoding. So we can do Control and U if we want to do URL encoding, or Control Shift and U to decode it again. So just another thing worth bearing in mind. And finally, let's have a look at the comparer. So let's go, and I'll clear the history here first of all. Just clear that up a little bit, and we'll reload this page. I'll actually send this off with some different values. Let's send this off with change me first of all, and then I'll send it off with hello the second time. Submit that, and now we can go to our HTTP history. We have two responses here. We can have a look at them here in more detail as well if we like. Note that you can also, if you want to try to render this, you can actually render them inside of Burp Suite as well, which in some cases might be handy, like the brute force, for example, or command injection. There's quite a lot. If you were just looking at the HTML, you'd have to scroll right down to actually have a look and see what was the message that returned. So in some cases, render might be useful there as well. But we can right click on one of these then. We'll send this to the comparer. You can either send the request or the response to the comparer, depending on what you want to compare. So we'll send that. We're going to have a look at the comparer. We have our first request there. Let's go back and send our second one as well. So we'll send that to the comparer. And then we have two items here which we can basically compare. So we can compare based on the length, we can compare based on the data. You can see here it'll do a word or byte level comparison between data. You can load, paste, or send data here from other tools and then perform the comparison you want. Again, note that I really don't use this very often at all, but maybe I should. I guess if you were doing bug bounties and stuff, this would probably come in a lot more useful than it does for me doing capture the flag challenges and hack the box machines and stuff like that. So apart from that, let's have a look at the macro option. So I'm not going into too much detail here. I want to keep this to the basics, and I think a separate video would really be required to go through macros in any detail. But if you go into project options and the sessions tab, you can set up some session handling rules here and add macros, so we can go and actually select any request from our HTTP history. We'll click OK, and then we can go and configure macros here. So you can see here it has the parameters that were available to us, the phrase and the token. And we can add custom parameters here as well. So there might be, for example, say there's a CSRF token or something that we want to extract each time. You can see that we'll be able to extract it using regex or based on the offset location. We can extract it, then we can do things with it. We might want to MD5 that and send that off, and you can set that all up to happen automatically on the fly. So it's been a while since I played around with these. I remember doing a Hack the Box web challenge. The MD5 one I actually solved using macros in Burp, so maybe when they retire that I'll come back and do a more detailed version. So finally, let's just have a look at some of the extensions that we can get as well. So if we go to the Extender tab, and you can see here we have extensions. I've already got a few installed here, and we can go into the App Store if we want to install more. So you can see here, we can go by the rating and see how popular they are. Note that you see a lot of them here require Burp Suite Pro, so you won't be able to use those. But there are some good resources out there to try and find some of the top extensions to install anyway. You can see here Logger++ was one of them. Some of these are paid for as well though. That's interesting. Hackverter is not mentioned there, okay. We can go and have a look through some of those in a bit more detail. Hackverter is probably the one that I would use the most in terms of its ability to encode and decode different data types, encrypt and decrypt, etc. And you saw earlier that we had the option of just sending things directly there as well. Logger++ is kind of a bit like this HTTP history tab, but more powerful in terms of what we can do with it. and our JSON Web Tokens will allow us to encode and decode JSON Web Tokens rather than go into a website to specifically do that for us. But I think that's covered most of the basics, or the basics that I know about Burp Suite. I'll do some more videos hopefully on this in future, maybe just drill down into some specifics or look specifically at certain plugins as well. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. Any questions or comments, leave them down below. Thanks.